attending.
Thank you. So it's 12. Do we want to wait a couple of minutes for people to come into the Zoom room here?
Sure, sure. We can keep playing the music if Frank, I know that I disrupted the music by sharing my screen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have your list too. I wonder if one of us could play, but I'm not sure how that works. Oh, I guess one of us could screen share one of the YouTube videos, I suppose.
Oh, yeah. I can do it.
Мы устали от тебя, мы не верим твоему слову.
Okay, I'll do this one. Or maybe, hold on. Oh, yeah.
Мы устали от тебя, мы не верим твоему слову. Как не можешь ты понять, жить хотим мы по-другому. Уходи, тихо, мирно и спокойно. Уходи, мы найдем себя достойных. Уходи, время смелых, а не трусов. Уходи, это воля белорусов. Мы хотим все поменять, мы хотим быть откровенны. Люди просят лишь одно: перемены, перемены. Уходи, тихо, мирно и спокойно. Уходи, мы найдем себя достойных. Уходи, время смелых, а не трусов. Уходи, это воля Беларусь.
All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started here. So to all of you who are attending, welcome. This is actually a really important occasion. It's the beginning of a series of conversations we're going to be having called The Art of Global Protest. It's really the brainchild of our own Central Washington University professor, Dr. Volha Isakova, who I will introduce in just a minute. I want to begin with the land acknowledgement. Even though we are in a virtual space, this is something that's sponsored by Central Washington University, and we should take a moment to acknowledge that the land on which Central Washington University resides is a historic home of the Yakima people. The federally recognized Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation are made up of the Klickitat, the Palouse, the Walla Walla, the Wanapum, the Wenatchee, the Wishram, and the Yakima people. The Yakima people remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it and protecting it as instructed by elders through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We give thanks to the legacy of the original people, their lives, and their descendants, and particularly Native American students who go to Central Washington University today. So I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Volha Isakova, who's going to introduce our panelists today. Volha, as I've come to know her, is a really valued colleague here of mine at Central Washington University. Volha has a PhD in Slavic languages from the University of Alberta. Here at Central Washington University, we have shared many students in that a lot of my museum studies students tend to take her classes in Russian language. And we've even collaborated with some of her students on projects. We actually worked with a student that we shared a few years back on a wonderful exhibit on the history of Soviet punk. So I'm so excited to be able to partner with you, Volha, on this event and on future events. I think this is a collaboration that has been years in the making, so I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Hope. Hello, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Hope Amerson, Lynn Benke, and the Museum of Culture and Environment at CWU for their support for this panel, and to thank Frank Jones, our webinar technology wizard that made this panel possible. And of course, I would like to thank our distinguished panelists, Arina Dmitrieva and Annika Walke, for joining us today to discuss the protests in Belarus. So my role here would be as a moderator, and I would like to introduce our topic of the protests in Belarus 2020 by giving you a brief history of the country and its protest movement. So I'm going to share my screen and we can start. Belarus 2020, history of protest. What is Belarus? Where is Belarus? So Belarus is a country in Eastern Europe. It has about 10 million people. It is known as a small country primarily because of its larger neighbors. It borders on Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. But fun fact is that Belarus can actually fit 2 Icelands or a whole of Washington state plus some Oregon too. Capital of Belarus, Minsk, is home to 2 million people, and the country has 6 regions in addition to the capital metropolitan area with their own large, vibrant cities. Belarus used to be part of the Soviet Union of the USSR as a Belarusian Soviet Republic. After the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Belarus has changed its name to Belarus and changed national insignia to the familiar red, white, red flag that you see in the background of my Zoom account. And these flags have become a very important symbol for the protests in Belarus in 2020 and throughout the protest movement history. So Belarus has become a parliamentary republic after 1991. A fun fact, again, is that the agreement about the dissolution of the Soviet Union was actually signed in Belarus. So fast forward to 1994. So Belarus gains its independence in 1991, and in 1994 it holds its first presidential democratic election, the first and the last election recognized by the European Union and the US. as being fair and democratic. A 39-year-old politician, Alexander Lukashenko, who you can see on the slide, is elected on the promise of economic change and standing up to the entrenched establishment that had mostly comprised of old Communist Party members, and he wins. And then Lukashenko has been in power ever since. That's 26 years. How did he do it? So I'm going to give you a little bit brief history. Lukashenko's playbook is really not that different from other autocrats like Vladimir Putin. In 1996 and 2004, Belarus held referenda that substantially altered the government makeup and constitution of the Belarusian Republic. So, in a nutshell, in 1995, there is a first referendum that returned the Soviet insignia of Belarusian Soviet Republic as official state flag of Belarus, getting rid of the white-red flag that is now a symbol of popular protests. It also returned the Russian language a status of state language. It was a major defeat for nationalist forces, another political faction that, along with former communist bureaucrats, comprised the political landscape in New Belarus. Belarus, as many other post-Soviet and post-socialist states, was suffering at the time in the 1990s from deep economic downturn and crippling inflation. Belarus was also and still remains predominantly Russophone, meaning that most people speak Russian as their native language. The referendum of 1996 exponentially expanded the presidential powers, making Belarus a de facto presidential, not parliamentary republic. In 1996, Russia and Belarus also signed an agreement for the close union between the two countries, kind of sealing the fate of Belarus being always in the orbit of Russia and Russia's influence rather than European Union. And that kind of tension will play on in the popular protest. The parliament tried to impeach Lukashenko in 1996, but lost. Lukashenko prevailed in the referendum, wildly viewed as rigged and fraudulent. Lukashenko dismisses the parliament, having an opportunity to create a subservient, toothless legislature. So that continues throughout late 1990s. Lukashenko solidifies power, cracks down on protests, opposition leaders, and journalists. By 1999, that's 6 years from his election, disappearing, jailing, and murder of opposition figures in Belarus is a tacitly acknowledged fact. By 2002, Lukashenko becomes persona non grata in Europe due to violations of human rights and democratic norms. Then comes referendum of 2004 that conveniently, of course, removes the limits of 2 terms for presidents. Just like in the US, Belarus constitution originally limited the presidential bid to 2 terms only. You know the other autocrat who also used the tactic of expanding presidential terms, that is Vladimir Putin. So by 2005, Lukashenko completely controls the legislative branch, the courts, media, education, and cultural institutions. The European Humanities University, where many of my colleagues and friends received a world-class education, is exiled to Lithuania in 2005. In 2005, an underground Belarus 3 theater is formed in opposition to the regime. Now they are exiled in London while also maintaining underground status and performance in Minsk. Laws that restrict Belarusians' movement, especially going abroad outside of the country, are enacted, as well as laws that punish students or workers for political dissent at the workplace or study place. I would say that authoritarian takeover is complete by 2005. We arrive at perilous and unforgiving reality of long-term protests in Belarus. And I would like to show you a video compiled by Sergei Isakov, which shows the history of Belarusian protests from 1991, even before Lukashenko had a grip on power, to today. These are elections of 1990 to the parliament. You could see the white, red, white flags flying. You also could, these massive strikes of 1991, when the economy was just beginning to go down in tatters. 1996, a confrontation between the police and protesters about referendum. Another march from 1999, March for Freedom, it is called. The famous Ploshcha protest in the wake of a fraudulent election 2006. A protest in 2010 against fraudulent election. People strike against a prohibitive and punitive laws against those who are unemployed, 2017. And finally, we arrive at 2020, the unprecedented mass protest. 11 Sundays in a row, people march on the streets against Lukashenko. Since August 9, hundreds and thousands of people are joining. Oops. Here we go. All right. So let's go back to our history of protest. So elections and protest 2006. By that point, Belarus had a law that includes punishment for so-called discreditation of the state, meaning any kind of bad information about the state of Belarus related to foreign bodies is punishable by imprisonment to up to 1 year. This law is masterminded by KGB, and Belarus is probably the only post-Soviet country that still has a secret police named KGB, and Lukashenko, in order to prevent the so-called color revolutions, the popular post-Soviet uprisings that already deposed corrupt regimes in Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia. The falsified election sparks the process known as Gene's Revolution, or Ploshcha 2006. It's based on the creation of a tent city. Right here, you can see it on the slide. It's a tent encampment by the opposition on the main square in Minsk. Thousands of people joined the protest against the fraudulent election 2006. Hundreds are arrested. The tent camp is brutally dispersed. Opposition candidates are jailed. Lukashenko heads for his third term. Belarus is now under sanctions from European Union and the US. Fast forward to election and protest 2010. Again, hundreds of thousands of people marched to protest fraudulent elections and are brutally dispersed. Over 700 people are jailed for rioting. Serious crackdown on opposition candidates and media is underway, including banning oppositional newspapers. So if we look at the banning of internet sites and other media access in the protest 2020, it has been happening for quite some time. KGB intimidation tactics are in full swing. People are taken out of their beds in the middle of the night and slapped with fake charges. Atmosphere of terror and fear reigns. The exodus of Belarusian political and cultural elites continues towards the asylum in the United States or European Union. You can also see on the image that there are European Union flags that are interspersed with Belarusian traditional democratic flag. And this is kind of a shift that's been happening with the Belarusian protest movement, is that the integration with the EU and upholding of European democratic values becomes the focus of oppositional campaign in Belarus that stays in sharp contrast with Lukashenko's close ties with Russia, already under authoritarian rule of Putin, and the sort of pariah state of Lukashenko, pariah status of Lukashenko's regime. Fast forward to election 2015. Opposition calls for election boycott, and that's what you see on the screen. Election boycott, since the elections are so rigged and fraudulent and all the opposition candidates get jailed and they are considered pointless. Lukashenko regime in 2015 buckles under the sanctions from EU and the US and releases political prisoners. These are elections least marked by popular protest. The country awaits change, but unfortunately in vain. And now we arrive at the election 2020. And I will only briefly mention some of the important aspects of the election and let our distinguished speakers speak for themselves. So 2020 protests are unprecedented. On August 9, Lukashenko won yet another term, condemned widely by international community's fraudulent election. the united opposition led by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who became a leader of the opposition because her husband, an original candidate for the president, was jailed, and she kind of picked up that mantle, rejects the result and is supported by hundreds and thousands of protesters marching on the streets. Here are the new feminine faces of the Belarusian leadership. You could see Maria Kolesnikova, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and Victoria Tsepkala. All of these women have stepped in to lead the oppositional movement in place of her husband, as in case in Tikhanovskaya and Victoria Tsepkala, and in place of their jailed candidate. Maria Kolesnikova was the coordinator for the Babariko election campaign. The 2020 protests are unprecedented in their scale, in their tenacity. People are marching every Sunday since August, widespread of support for opposition in the regions, striking on the major factories, and a lot of grassroots organization and support. They are also known for extraordinary police brutality, including the use of live fire, which means real bullets, right? Torture and rape. 3 people have died, over 100 are missing, hundreds have been arrested and brutalized. There are several famous images that you can see on the screen. And to the left, you could see how the small group of protesters is rounded in so-called chain, because you have to hold on to one another as the special forces try to isolate small groups of protesters and then arrest them all in kind of small chunks, since there's such a huge protest. Okay, and then, so I would like to start introducing our panelists who will tell you a lot more about this protest 2020. But before I do that, if you probably noticed that one of our panelists is an empty chair. And I would like to introduce you to Olga Shparaga. Olga Shparaga is a prominent philosopher, educator, and activist with an international reputation. She studied philosophy in Belarus and Germany, taught at the exiled European Humanities University in Czech Republic, Poland, Lithuania, Germany, and the US. She's a founder of the European Liberal Arts College in Belarus and a founder of Feminist Coalition of the United Opposition Coordination Council for the Peaceful Transfer of Power in Belarus 2020. Olga has published several books, including award-winning Community After Holocaust, Towards an Inclusive Society from 2018, and The Awakening of Body Politic, Essays on the Philosophy of Civic Society from 2010. Olga was supposed to join us for today's panel. However, she was arrested during a protest and sentenced to 2 weeks in jail. In solidarity with Olga, we honor her place at this panel with an empty chair, and we demand that Belarusian authorities release her and all political prisoners of conscience. Free Olga Shparaga. And now I would like to introduce you to our distinguished panelists. Arina Dmitrieva is a researcher at the Institute for the Rule of Law at the European Universities in St. Petersburg. She is also a PhD candidate at the University of Eastern Finland. She holds a master's in sociology from the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences and in Law and Economics from University of Bologna. She primarily focuses on the study of the Russian judicial and law enforcement system, legal professions, and reforms of judicial and law enforcement systems in Eastern Europe. She is an author of multiple articles on criminal justice in Russia, policing, and constitutional justice. She is co-author of a Russian Judges as a Professional Group, a sociological study. Her new book is devoted to the study of legal education. Welcome, Arina. And our second distinguished panelist is Annika Walke, is Associate Professor of History at Washington University in St. Louis, with affiliations in international and area studies, Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern studies, and women, gender, and sexuality studies. Annika's research and teaching interests include World War II and Nazi genocide, migration, nationality policies, and oral history in the former Soviet Union and Europe. Her book, Pioneers and Partisans, An Oral History of Nazi Genocide in Belarus, came from Oxford University Press in 2015. It weaves together oral histories, video testimonies, and memoirs to show how the first generation of Soviet Jews experienced the Nazi genocide and how they remember it after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. A current research project is devoted to the long aftermath of the Holocaust and World War II in Belarus. Annika is affiliated with the Holocaust Geographies Collaborative. She currently serves as a co-PI of the Holocaust Ghettos Project, reintegrating victims and perpetrators through places and events, a NEH-funded endeavor to develop a historical GIS of Nazi-era ghettos in Eastern Europe. Welcome, Annika. And I will give the podium to Arina.
Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight, because it's night in St. Petersburg. Yeah, and I'm gonna I have to commit that I left Belarus 10 years ago to work in St. Petersburg, and it happened just a month before 2010 elections. But the elections at that time, 2010, they were so traumatic experience for the whole society. So for the next 10 years, we barely considered any political participation available and possible for the Belarusian society. But so I quietly worked in St. Petersburg and studied in Finland for my PhD. And this year, everything changed. And I'm gonna now tell a little bit about what has been changing in Belarus for last 10 years, and how protests of such a scale became possible, and what happened in election week in Belarus, in a regional capital of city of Grodno, because I'm not from capital city. I was born and lived in Grodno. And Grodno is a capital of a region near Poland and Lithuania. And I was an independent observer of election in this city. So I will also share my screen and give you some presentation. So why Belarus? Why do Belarusians protest? And from outside, it seems that Belarusians are very quiet and very felt quite well with its authoritarian leader, who made possible for them to earn reasonable amount of money, and some economic development has happened. But at the same time, we observed a number of small scale but widespread protests that were fired by different government actions. In 2011, there was mass protests when people simply gathered on street and clapped and showed their silent protests against rapid price increase, against financial crisis. So altogether, it continued 70 days, and at least in 17 cities, people went to the street. In 2011, in 2017, as Olga mentioned, there was protest against social parasite law, and it was even longer and even more massive because it continued more than half a year. It also covered 18 cities, and many people were also detained during that protests. as I said, the people in Belarus can earn reasonable amount of money, but the annual GDP growth was quite low during these last 10 years, and it forced widespread migration. And according to United Nations evaluation, about more than 1 million Belarusians live abroad. It's compared to the number of Polish people who live abroad. And Belarusians who live abroad are simply non-visible because they mostly speak Russian and quite often are considered as Russians, not as Belarusians. In foreign countries. And now we see that this huge wave of diaspora solidarity when Belarusian people also became visible also on the streets of different cities all around the world. So this is a picture to show the GDP growth, and then basically shows that it only once over the last 10 years, it was higher than 5%, which is extremely low for a developing country. And also Belarusians protest because there was a widespread non-political repression. And it's quite often Belarusian economy is characterized as a state-owned economy entirely, but it's not correct because more than half of people works in a private companies, and the Belarusian government quite severely persecute businessmen for even small violations of economic crimes. And there is a huge number of practices for which you could be penalized or imprisoned in Belarus. And recently it became clear that these economic actions and business actions are not really a crime. So for many people who were victims of this criminal of persecution for their economic activities, now they are amnested, or there is a kind of discussion of decriminalization. There was a discussion of on decriminalization because right now there is no like any social issue discussion except politics. And also there was a wide-scale war on drugs, which is actually comparable to some war on drugs in some states in US, because even possession of small amount of marijuana could bring you to prison for 8 years. And it's not a joke. Even if you have only one joint in your pocket and you are caught by police, you can be in prison for like 5-7 years. And this war on drugs brought to prison more than 10,000 people, mostly young people, and their mothers initiated so-called Mothers Movement 321 after the number of article of criminal code, and actually the code was changed. So some of these children, these mothers' children, were freed in the beginning of 2020s. It's a bit of why people protest. It's probably it's not on all the reasons, but I'm not talking about obvious ethical reasons, kind of the tiredness of authoritarian rule, etc. I'm talking about more about like different social activities which were happening in Belarus. So how protests became possible. First, what what is special about Belarus is as compared to Russia, where I live, I can compare these two countries, and I would say that digital technologies are way more widespread in Belarus than for instance, in Russia. So a lot of activities, financial services, government services, a lot of different activities moved digital, and yeah, it simply became like usual practice to use smartphone in everyday life, and also the lack of independent mass media increased interest to alternative sources of information, and it made popular different electronic newspapers like news sources like Tutbay, Kuku, Nash, and others. Also, recently, Telegram channels started to become popular, different Vkontakte communities. So there were a lot of alternative sources to gain information. Second thing which probably distinguished Belarus or was special in Belarus for for last decade was the gradual cultural separation from Russia, I would say, and from Soviet past. So the whole society was gradually maturing, culturally maturing, and especially a soft it happened soft Belarusiization. Belarusian language started to be more popular and stopped to be associated only with opposition. And also even Belarus ornament earned worldwide popularity, and it's obvious because, for instance, in 2014, Snoop Dogg issued its collection of Belarusian ornament, and it was even published in the Washington Post. Or Valentino opened his haute couture show with some Belarus ornament. So, and it was very highly prized by Belarusian society. So people in Belarus stopped to neglect Belarusian symbols, but started to like and love them. There also happened a widespread grassroots mobilization. It was mostly since in authoritarian regimes, social movements are almost impossible because they are always stopped by government. So the only safe place to act actively was some ecological volunteering, some small urban initiatives, and charity initiatives started to grow. So there were different small scale but widespread grassroots mobilization initiatives. And and the last thing what happened in 2020 was Lukashenko's COVID-19 denialism, because he completely denied the essence of COVID. He and it forced people to solidarize and to start protect themselves. to start a fight with this problem by themselves. They started to gather money for doctors. They started to feed doctors who were locked in hospitals. They started to share to provide doctors apartments to rent because they were in too dangerous situation to go to their families because they were always in contact with sick people. So there was a huge wave of solidarity, which also united people around different anti-COVID initiatives. It always a question for scholars who study authoritarian regimes, why authoritarian incumbent at all allows elections. And because elections could bring something unexpected. And these elections, 2020 elections, brought three interesting and completely new opposition candidates. First strong candidate was Viktor Babarika, a banker and a founder of art gallery. And he was arrested almost immediately after he announced that he is going to run for presidency. Valery Tsepkalo is a founder of high-tech park of Belarus. It's a kind of Silicon Valley for Belarus, and he was forced to leave country. He was expelled from country. And Sergei Tikhanovsky, a husband of current country leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, he was a YouTube blogger. He a director of and he was also arrested even before Babarika. So all these three candidates were very new on political scene. And once they were not allowed to run for presidency, three women stepped on their place. First was Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who was allowed to run for presidency by Central Electoral Commission, and Veronika Tsepkalo, a wife of Valery Tsepkalo, and Maria Kolesnikova, head of Babarika's shtab. So these three women united in order to win the election, and then so now I'm turning to the electoral process in Belarus, and I only need to say 2 words about how elections in Belarus can be how frauds on election of Belarus can be possible. First source of fraudulence is the composition of electoral commissions, because members of electoral commission are mainly teachers who are in direct dependence of the chair of electoral commission, who is usually a school principal. So when you see electoral commission is usually formed from 5 teachers and 1 head of commission, who is simultaneously head of these people in the normal working process. So this subordination makes commission very dependent on what principal will say. And also the observers who are allowed to observe elections are mainly pro-governmental. And second source of fraudulence is two-stage voting process, because the voting process in Belarus consists of 2 parts: early voting, which takes 5 days, and main day of voting, which happened on 9th of August. So, and in order to decrease the scale of fraudulence, decrease the scale of fraud, the campaign of independent observation was initiated by the staff of Babarika, but also by different non-partisan initiatives. So altogether in Belarus, there were about 6,000 polling stations, for which 43,000 pro-governmental observers were appointed, and about 10,000 independent observers tried to observe elections. They were mostly representative of three initiatives. It's Honest People, Честные люди, initiative which delegated. Nobody knows the real number because there were no statistical counting of honest people, because most of honest people, not most, some of honest people were simply not accredited as independent observers. So another initiative was Right to Choose. And third initiative was Human Rights Defenders for Free Elections. And I was an independent observer with this initiative. And so in order to be an independent observer and also dependent observer, you need to have some training. And in this year, it was organized mostly online through mock platforms Tepic, through YouTube lectures, Zoom lectures, and in our initiative, which was run by human rights defenders, the girl who organized these online trainings, she was detained and accused in criminal violation as a person who trained people to so basically she was arrested for her activity as an organizer of online trainings. And also before elections, they started online platform where observers could register electoral malpractices. So here's a list of different types of violations which were trained to observe. And what are most common violations? Ballot stuffing, increasing turnout rates through forcing people to go on early elections, different mistakes and in voter registration. And so the number of possible violations is quite high, and we were trying to make a report of these types of violations. And the main violations which were faced during this observation campaign was the fact that we were simply not allowed to enter polling stations due to COVID. And it was very strange because on the one hand, Lukashenko denied COVID. On the other hand, it was used as an excuse not to allow independent observers to observe elections. So you see here a man who stands on and watch through the window the turnout of voters. You see myself writing numerous complaints, and so we basically were writing complaints and counting people from outside the polling station, because it was only way for us to count turnout of voters. So, and what we observe, it's from my observation. On the left, you see my notes of how many voters entered the polling station, and if you calculate, you will see that there were on 5th of August, there were only 54 people who entered the doors of polling station. But in protocol, the commission wrote that that day 131 person voted. And it was not only me who observed this mismatch of what was going in reality and what was written on paper. So we reported this in different. So we discussed it with other observers. We discussed it with our friends, and everyone knew the scale of malpractices and the scale of, for instance, turnout. The scale where turnout was falsified. And on the day of election, it was very funny and very nervous atmosphere, because you see here is a small white booth, white minibus, where a couple of policemen were sitting and waiting when commissions will count the votes. And you see protocols from different electoral commissions from the same school. First, shows that Lukashenko won over Tikhanovskaya for like 2051 over 331. And the second shows completely different numbers. It's again Lukashenko won, but with not with such a huge difference. And it was a sign that if there were no falsification of turnout, probably the second protocol would give the victory to Tikhanovskaya, not to Lukashenko. And it was only on my polling station, but such a situation was all around the country. So it fired the protests, and there are some pictures of protests in Grodno. In Grodno was probably the most successful city over the whole 2 weeks, 2 months of protest, because for 2 days, city government allowed people to protest on streets. So for 2 days, the city belonged to opposition, or not opposition because Tikhanovskaya won, so to people who knew that Tikhanovskaya won, to people who were against Lukashenko, people who was against Lukashenko. Then Lukashenko happened to return Well, so then it was not so successful, and workers of the city started to went to strike, and they went to the streets. In the small cities, even like smaller cities like Wakawisk is like small regional city of 50,000 people. People also went to protest, and now we observe 11th week of protests, and it probably will not stop if unless Lukashenko leaves his chair and new elections will happen. So thank you very much, and I hope you.
Thank you so much, Arina. I would like to pass the mic to Annika now.
Means I have to click my microphone. So, good afternoon. Thank you for joining this nice panel discussion. It's really interesting for me to hear from Arina from kind of firsthand what it looks like in Belarus, in Grodno, a place that I greatly enjoyed when I visited not too long ago. So just a little bit of more background about myself and my relationship to Belarus, because obviously I'm not there. What I'm going to say is based on very distant observation of the last few weeks. But on the other hand, I've spent a fair amount of time in Belarus in the last about 5 years, primarily for research purposes. I travel there somewhat regularly, at least once, sometimes twice a year. For several weeks. And during those several weeks, I've been quite well introduced, I think, to that part of society that currently is in the streets in Belarus. So a lot of what I'm going to say, I think, is based on kind of my kind of personal impressions and understandings, but obviously because Volha basically invited me to join this panel when Olga was detained. I'm also going to try to channel some of her analysis from which I've greatly benefited, and I've learned a lot from her over the past few years. So I'm going to try to introduce a few of her kind of ideas that she has spoken about very, very widely, as well as said in many different countries, and also written about in many, many different venues. So again, I've been spending a lot of time in Belarus recently, but certainly not enough to actually give you a full picture and a full-blown analysis. And I think many of us who are interested in Belarus, who study Belarus, are still really ourselves still trying to figure out what is actually happening and where this is going, especially because that's certainly one of the most important questions I think we all would like to answer. And unfortunately, I don't think we can say that at this point. So Živie Belarus. This is one of the kind of major slogans that you can hear if you watch videos from the protests. That's widely been cited. It's written on the posters. And that slogan, "Long live Belarus," to some might indicate that this is a national protest, that this is a national protest movement that is kind of trying to shore up more national sentiment, and in that sense might seem somewhat dangerous. And I have to admit, in the first weeks, I was very attentively following what was happening in Belarus. And there were moments when I was like, where is this going? Because of the use of national symbols, those slogans, and looking to Poland, looking to Hungary, looking to some other Eastern European countries. I think that reference to kind of this national symbolism could, of course, seem somewhat problematic. So I've started to kind of dig a little bit deeper and also try to see what many others have to say about that. And I think it really turns out that this is not a nationalist or national protest. I think in Olga's words, actually, she calls it a post-nationalist protest, because it tries to go beyond the nation, beyond constructing a society that is built around a question of national identity. But it really is more of a movement very much triggered by the election, I think, by the election fraud and the very fraught electoral process leading up to the elections. But it's much more of a protest that is geared toward implementing the rule of law, that is trying to reinstate the constitution as a framework that is actually governing society's life, and that is a reliable framework for people to act within. And of course, free elections as one of the elements that really identifies a democratic society, aside many problems that democratic societies have as well. So in that sense, what Olga would say, it really isn't geared toward creating a national Belarus that is especially not mono-ethnic, but it is much more attentive to kind of the different identities that people bring into society, the different needs that people have, and in which they can feel like they actually are supported as people. And again, she's written about those issues in many instances. And in that sense, I think I've learned a lot from her, but also just looking at the dynamics of the protests in the last few weeks, I think it's pretty obvious that this is not kind of a political project that the so-called old opposition has pursued, especially in the late 90s. That was often more nationalistic than I think we would have liked, or we would like at this point. So in that sense, it's a different kind. It has a different goal. It is a very different different momentum, so to speak, that is there. And that momentum, I think, also shows in the quality of the way in which the protest is organized, in the sense that it really isn't concentrated in Minsk. Where much of the other protests that Volha talked about, and Arina as well, they were often really focused on the capital and very much often focused on the elections. But now we're actually looking at, again, 11 weeks of protest around the country. So that there was at one point on the 16th of August, there were about 500,000 people in the streets in the whole country. So 500,000 people demonstrating for free elections, against police violence, and for a freer society. And that's special. That was very unique for Belarus. That had not happened before. And so the fact that people literally in small villages are creating solidarity chains, are articulating their discontent, and are willing to be arrested for that, I think is really a new level of protest that we're seeing here. It's also different in the sense that it's been 11 weeks. In previous electoral cycles, often the protests went on for a few days, in major part because they were cracked down upon very violently. Many people were arrested, but I think the sheer size of the protest currently makes it impossible for the government to stop that protest. But I think there's also a much broader base for those protests, and in that sense, it is a different kind of movement that we're seeing now that is not kind of rallying around only individual people, even though Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya certainly plays a very important role. But I think what we're seeing is also different kinds of protests that are not only, quote unquote, seen in the streets in the form of political rallies and demonstrations, but there's a variety of activities that you can observe. It is people in these like neighborhoods, in the Dvore, gathering in the evenings and kind of trying to create different cultural events, kind of networks of mutual support. Very creative. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of theater, there's a lot of kind of independent activity that people are bringing to the table, so to speak, to really, I think, prefigure a different kind of society that they want to see. So it's not only always against something, against the government, against the diselected president, but it's also for something. There really is an idea of creating something new out of this very autocratic society. And it's moments like when businesses that were targeted during those demonstrations that were destroyed, like a cafe in the streets of Minsk, that the next day you see a long line of people trying to buy coffee just to support that business. Same thing we saw a few weeks ago after one of the owners of a flower shop was violently beaten up and arrested. The next day there were like thousands of people who wanted to buy flowers to the extent that they couldn't actually provide that for everybody. So there's a level of support, I think, for each other that really shows a different quality to the protest that I find very intriguing, and I think is also very important. And then I think it's especially that that sense of collectivity, that sense of creating kind of networks of support, of care, if you will, that signal a new situation in Belarus that shows something new. And I think and I hope it is a promise. I hope it is a promise for something new to emerge out of this. But of course, it demands a lot of stamina, as we're already seeing. So, and if we're looking at this kind of from a more, I don't know, analytical, sociological perspective, I think what has been often used to describe these forms of support is a term of horizontal solidarity. And that is, again, something that Olga Szparaga has written about in many ways. And just very recently in an interview, actually, after the first time she was arrested, she talked about the fact that we don't need a strong state, we need a strong society. We actually need strong civic structures of people living together. And that is an idea, I think, that in many ways she worked out in her book, Post-Holocaust Community. For those of you who read Russian, which is, I think, one of the best philosophical books I've read in a long time, because it really tries to work through some historical trends and developments, but also tries to develop a vision for the future. And so not by accident, I think it received major recognition in Belarus and beyond. But in that way, that analysis of horizontal solidarity, what Olga would say is really trying to think about a collective framework that includes a variety of people and that respects a variety of people in their variety, in their diversity, so that women, men, young people, old people, people with disabilities, queer folks, that they all can find a mode of living together without creating hierarchies. And I think in a way we're seeing that actually in the streets. First of all, of course, with the women's marches, and I'm going to talk about the role of women a little bit more in just a minute. But we've also seen demonstrations and rallies organized by pensioners, by people who are retired, who for a long time were kind of seen as Lukashenko's most stable base. But it actually turns out that the social crisis that Arina already described has actually hit them quite hard, even though they're always presented as that part of society that is well taken care of. It's actually not true. We also have seen protests by people with disabilities who really articulate very publicly that they're not taken care of, that they're not well represented in society. Quite the opposite, that they're actually often discriminated against and treated quite violently, and you can see that. So in a way, this hope or this vision of a different society, I think, really comes out of an increasing socioeconomic crisis, which again Arina has already talked about. So I'm going to keep that pretty short. But I think in many ways that also explains the very gendered nature of the protest as we're seeing it, in particular the role of women that seems very, very prominent. And we should probably talk about to what extent that is real. And then I see kind of two elements that I want to briefly touch upon here that might explain why there are so many women and then so prominently involved in those protests. The first one is kind of, I think, a structural crisis that we're seeing here, that for many years, Lukashenko has always promoted kind of the welfare state that he provides, and he personally, of course, provides a state that takes care of everybody, that takes care of children, of the elderly, of the ill, but that became increasingly untrue over the past few years. That many of the social services were actually not sufficient, did not provide sufficiently, and the COVID crisis, I think, really brought that home very, very drastically, that there really wasn't, on one hand, of course, there was a denial of among the state that there actually was a pandemic, that there is an actual crisis that they need to take care of. But I think on the other hand, it also did show that there just aren't enough resources being made available for some of those problems that people have. So that the claiming of social rights is, I think, a major part of these protests, in addition to protesting this very autocratic and undemocratic political structure. I think there's also the social question that poses itself in the streets as something that needs to be addressed. And the so-called social question is always gendered. It always makes us think about the so-called reproductive labor, meaning the kind of labor that we provide to take care of the ill, to take care of the elderly, to raise our children. And the fact that about 85% of the workers in the healthcare system, in the social services are women, means that they are also the ones who are the ones primarily exposed to that crisis, that are dealing with the lack of support, with the lack of resources. And I think that brought many women into the streets. In addition to, I think, a fairly deeply ingrained patriarchal system that, for instance, as Irina Solomatina regularly points out, there's a 30% pay gap between men and women in Belarus. So there's a level of discrimination on the economic level that really does not bode well for people who want to be part of a modern world, who see themselves as global citizens and who want to participate in a democratic society. And just this morning, I mean, it's just another example. The Belsat had a report about the Teacher of the Year award that was given, that was awarded. And Irina again pointed out that 81.4% of all the teachers in Belarus are women, but the Teacher of the Year is, of course, a man. So it's moment like that, and that's not the first time that this has happened regularly in the past. It's moment like that where there's just a deep-seated patriarchy or patriarchal system that is increasingly frustrating, I think, to major parts of the population, in addition to the very concrete, I think, humiliation that Lukashenko himself produced in May when he claimed that women just can't be president because they would crush under the burden of running a country. So there's a long-standing, I think, social crisis and social inequality that brings people into the street, and maybe in particular women. On the other hand, and that kind of explains, I think, the kind of protest and the kind of protest activity that we're seeing here, is that social crisis has, I think, facilitated the development of, and Arina already talked about that again, a whole series of grassroots initiatives that were trying to address those problems, that were essentially trying to provide support for people with disabilities, for children who are terminally ill, that were trying to address environmental issues, that were working against the discrimination of LGBTQ people, that were working to crack down on the war on drugs and so forth. And it's that infrastructure, I think, of social initiatives, in addition to a very lively art and creative scene that has accompanied that process for many years, that I think really facilitates the kind of protest that we're currently seeing in the form of rallies, but I think actually also the kind of day-to-day activities that really show people's frustration with state politics and state systems of injustice. Just as a historian, I just want to briefly mention here that this is not unique. We've seen similar moments in history in a variety of societies and historical moments. One of them, for instance, is the 1917 Russian Revolution, where actually the protests of women against the bread shortages or food shortages during the war were some of the main events that led to the resignation of the Tsar's government. But it's also here in the United States where you have the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a very it's a non-violent movement, very similar to the Belarusian protest movement that was founded by young women as well, who really saw the political problem also as a social problem. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, that what we're seeing in Belarus is great and it's wonderful, but is also not unique. So if we really want to think about protest dynamics, I think it's often important to kind of widen our scope a little bit. But just a few final comments on the role of women in the protest, because I think there were also some very concrete events that really brought women into the public with regards to the protest right now. I already mentioned Lukashenko's quote earlier that women would not be, essentially not be able to be president after Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya had declared her candidacy after her husband was arrested and detained. And in the response to that, of course, we have the emergence of the kind of Kolesnikova, Tsikhanouskaya, Tsepkalo triangle. But there was also a moment before that when Babariko was arrested on what I think are trumped up charges, but where the art collection that he had created was arrested. And it really was written about as it was arrested. And the symbol of that arrest became a painting of a woman named Eva by Chaim Sutin, a Jewish artist who was actually born in Belarus and then emigrated to France and became part of the so-called French school that whose most prominent representative was probably Marc Chagall. But Eva, as this very, I think, strong female figure, very quickly became kind of an icon of the protest even before the election. And you may have noticed on the picture of Olga Shparaga that Anya Redko produced yesterday or just a few days ago, she's actually wearing a t-shirt with that image. And I remember she was very excited about that t-shirt when she managed to get one. So there's also kind of a symbolism in the protest that is very gendered and that I think is highly interesting. On the other hand, I also want to remind us that Tsikhanouskaya was not the first female candidate for a presidential election in Belarus, but there was actually in 2015 Tatiana Karatkevich, who ran for a party named People's Referendum, received just under 5% of votes officially. Okay, of course, again, we don't know the actual numbers. But so there's a history even to the very public political activity of women in Belarusian society that we should not forget and that we should also consider when we're thinking about why these three women, Tsikhanouskaya, Kolesnikova, and Tsepkalo, gained so much support among the population. Because certainly that didn't come out of nowhere. I think none of these moments happened just by accident or out of nowhere. So there's, on one hand, just to sum up very briefly, there's on one hand, I think, a deep socioeconomic crisis that is heavily gendered and that brings people into the street based on their identity. But there are also some very public moments of representation that I think facilitate a population's willingness to follow the lead of female leaders as we've seen here. But again, on the other hand, I actually think that the absence of a strong leader, I mean, Tsikhanouskaya is in exile, most other political leaders are in exile or are in prison, actually allows for this new space for a new kind of protest to emerge, which I think is very, very interesting. And that also makes it so hard to really predict what is going to happen. So I think it's something that we have not seen before in that quality. I'm going to leave it at that. There's probably some questions. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arina and Annika. We are now inviting questions. Please post your questions in the Q&A. Задавайте ваши питания на белорусской мове или по-русски or in English. You can ask your questions in 3 languages, English, Belarusian, or Russian. And we already have one question. The question is, I've seen cultural pushback against both Putin and European intervention in the Belarus protest movement. What do the panelists think are the most likely outcomes for a Belarus that does not want to embrace either neighbor? Is there a way when Belarus is not tied to European Union or Russia?
I'm not an expert in political science. I've never studied it. But I think from what is pretty obvious is that Belarus, if hopefully when Lukashenko will step down and a new society has a chance to develop, I think it will need a lot of support. I think it will need quite a substantial form of economic support. And the question is, of course, where that comes from. And so the European Union, I know, is preparing some packages that will provide that kind of support. And Russia obviously is very interested in that as well. But I think what's difficult to gauge here is what actually the Belarusians want. And I don't really see a clear picture in that regard. There was a recent survey of the London-based Chatham House that gauged kind of the way in which Belarusians actually see the protest movement. And what they figured out was actually that it's very, very split. There was very split attitude among people with regard to their support for either Russia and the European Union. And so I think what would be most productive probably for Belarusian society itself would be to try to find a balance. But of course, we also know that's very unlikely, right? I mean, it would be hard to do both. It would be hard to say, okay, let's work with the European Union and let's work with Russia. But on the other hand, it's kind of the only way for Belarus to maintain its independence and sovereignty is to really embrace that position of in-betweenness in some ways, and essentially being also kind of a bridge. It could be that bridge, but it's going to be really, really hard to achieve that because, of course, there's great concern among not only analysts, but I think also rightly so among the Belarusian population that whatever political change is going to happen will come with a major drawbacks for the social and economic situation within the country. So that neoliberal restructuring, as many other Eastern European countries have underwent it in the years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union, that is certainly a scary prospect. And I'm sure that's on many people's minds and also makes it so hard to decide either or. Yeah. So that's a non-answer to that question.
No, I completely agree. Arina, would you like to take a stab at this question?
Yeah, actually, it's always very difficult to answer questions. What are possible outcomes of these protests? And but I would say that in some way, Belarus probably would be in a position like Finland was in 1989 or 1990 when Soviet Union started to split down. And yeah, Finland was always a part of European Union, but it was very dependent economically on Russia. And when Russia became full in on Soviet Union, and when Russia was in economic crisis, for Finland, it was very, very difficult to balance its economy. I'm answering only about economic situation. So, and if protest and when protest win, it definitely will be some cut of economic ties with Russia. And then Belarus will need to find its own way to deal with economic consequences of political changes. Yes, ideally, the country will find some balance, and it's quite obvious that Europe is very interested and actually ready to develop kind of a Marshall Plan for Belarus, but then it's also like we have Russia on the eastern part, like on the eastern border, and with Russia, it's always unpredictable. So no outcome can be predicted when you have Russia as an eastern neighbor.
Oi. Thank you. We have a couple more questions. So another question is, and that's actually, I confess, that is a very, general question, but I want to know an answer to it as well. What seems like the most likely trajectory of the protests in Belarus? What will be their most likely outcome? And I understand that we are in a realm of conjecture, meaning we do not really know, But what do you think is going to happen? What's going to happen to protests? What's going to happen to Belarus?
So now I'm taking interviews with observers all around Belarus. So I'm taking them through Zoom or other things, and to some extent, I observe that they a bit less optimistic than it was in August or September or beginning of October, because everyone is tired. But the long time goes after the peak of protests, the more different social activities these people try to participate. Like in my personal case, also I'm outside of country now. I'm still working to support civic activities of my city. In my city, I developed some analytics to um, to start dialogue with bureaucrats, with city governors, with regional governors, because when and I know that many people in all around the country do the same. So we start to exchange letters with our parliament representative. We started, like, my friends go to talk to her, and etc etc etc. So different civic activity, like not civic, political activities, because once you start to communicate with city government, with regional government, with um, parliament, you are involved in political activities. So it started as a kind of observation, but now it's developing in more different types of political participation, which was never before. Like there was some kind of civic participation, but there were no political participation, and now it's changing. So it will take time, but it is changing, and I hope it will not stop now.
Thank you. Annika,
Mhm.
what is your prognosis for the protests in for Belarus?
I don't know. I just wanted to say I thought that was a really interesting insight, and I'd be curious to see if that plays out in the capital and on higher levels of government as well. Because that I think is where it gets really interesting. Because I think there were a number of us scholars from within the country and outside of the country who have written letters, who've collected signatures and submitted them to authorities, and we never heard back. So it's interesting to see that there is a beginning dialogue, at least on some level. So I'm really curious to see what happens to that. On the other hand, I mean, again, that survey or that poll that was conducted and was released 2 days ago, where about 83% of the people who are currently protesting said that they intend to continue until their demands are met, which of course is very promising, and I hope that is the case. But I think we all know the winter is coming, and a lot of things that are currently happening rely on people gathering outdoors. COVID is an issue. I mean, the numbers from Belarus are very, very worrisome. So that I think there's really some new forms of interaction and engagement I think have to be developed, and I think it really depends on how that plays out. I mean, on the other hand, we also should not forget the ultimatum that has been set for
Mentioning it, yes.
right.
Tell a little bit more to our audience. They probably don't know what the ultimatum is.
Okay, well, maybe Arina can speak more to that. But Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the presidential candidate who presumably received many more votes than the current president who's holding on to his seat, has issued an ultimatum to Lukashenko to step down and to fulfill the three central demands: free election, end of police violence, release of all political prisoners by the 26th, I think, if I'm not mistaken. and essentially said if they do not fulfill those demands, there will be general strike in the country. And so it remains, of course, to be seen whether that is going to happen. I think I find it very difficult to make any kind of speculation about that from afar. I mean, I follow social media as much as I can, and many of the conversations indicate that there is a prospect for that to happen. But of course, I'm also well aware that if there is that activity, it will not be looked upon kindly by the sitting government. So there certainly is also a looming threat, I think, of an escalation of violence that I think is definitely there. So I think the next week is going to be very, very important and might tell us more about where things are developing.
And I think that the international attention to Belarus, that's kind of goes in waves, right? It's kind of waning. And that is the prime time for like the escalated violent crackdown. And I just hope it's not going to happen. Okay, we have several more. Oh, Arina, did you want to say something?
No, on ultimatum, no, because I think Annika said everything. Yeah. First, when Tikhanovskaya made ultimatum, I was kind of confused and not sure that it was a correct, right step on right time. But now I'm kind of less suspicious about it, and I really hope that strikes will happens and will happen. Yeah.
I mean, something needs to happen. I think something major needs to happen. I think you cannot expect people to continue to march every Sunday for months without any kind of result, other than more arrests and more people being put in prison for 2 weeks or more. So I think I was somewhat surprised as well, but I think it also was important. It was a question of time until something like that needed to happen. So.
Thank you very much. We have a few more questions. The question in Russian, which I will read in Russian and then translate. Ваше мнение как внутреннего наблюдателя из региона Беларуси, Арине Дмитриевой, как меняются белорусские женщины в провинции в последние годы, что привело к женскому активному протесту в 2020, а именно учащихся и пенсионерок? The question is primarily for Arina, but I think Annika can answer it too. What is different about the women's activism in the regions? What has changed that we have a spike in feminist women activity among pensioners, people who are retired, among students, especially in the protest 2020?
Well, since question is addressed to me, I will try to answer, but honestly, since I rarely be in Minsk, I rarely visit Minsk, I cannot compare province with Minsk. And this time, first, what was special about the whole protest, and I'm not sure that any of us mentioned it, that it was not a youngsters protest. It was mid-age protests. And in terms of women participation, like everywhere else in a country, they went to the street because it was safer for them, because they were not supposed to be hardly beaten, because of course some women were detained, but they were treated way more lightly. And I'm not kind of like, I don't know why all people around me who are active are women, but they also have men who are active in their own way. And for instance, like girls who sign petitions, or like people who sign petitions are girls, but their husbands were observers. People who like they together go to the street. So I don't. I'm not quite sure actually how to answer this question because like, I've never did any research on it.
Okay, thank you. Annika?
Yeah, I mean, I also didn't really systematically try to study or better understand this. So this is more kind of an anecdotal observations that I can share. Because in the last few years, I did travel around the country a little bit, and including very small villages and towns, and especially I went to the kind of the northwest of the country, Verkhnitvinsk, and some of the places down there, which were some of the poorest areas of Belarus. And I was
Yes.
frankly shocked by the level of poverty that I saw there in the villages. I was prepared, but I was still somewhat shocked by the level of deprivation that people are experiencing there. And almost all the people I interacted with there were women, and almost all of them were somehow active in trying to organize support networks for elderly, for people who are ill, or other kind of civic society type activities. And many of them were actually older. Many of them were retirees, and they were not young people because most young people leave if they can. So I think in that sense, the activism that I think we're seeing in the smaller towns and villages is not the same as, let's say, in Minsk, which I think is quite urban, very young, even though there are also all generations involved. But if you look at the footage, the visuals that we get from more rural areas, I think it's actually more the older generation, which I find is very instructive. And I mean, these are people who survived or lived through perestroika, but who've also lived through late Stalinism. So who've kind of lived through a number of different crises. And I think that experience certainly doesn't necessarily, excuse me, predisposes them to speaking up now and demanding change. But maybe it was a boiling point. Maybe this was the moment was like this, now we're done. Now we really want change. We want something different. And on the other hand, just another dimension here, I think that what I've noticed and what many people have written about is that the creative scene that we have seen emerging in Grodno, in Brest, in Minsk, in Vitebsk, there's a lot of young women involved, and they kind of carry that infrastructure that becomes now really, really relevant for what is happening now. So I think we should really not underestimate the foundational work over the last decade or so that went into creating the infrastructure for much of what is happening now. And that is not to discount any male participation, but I think it often falls by the wayside when we look at kind of the social infrastructure that we need to feed ourselves, to take care of the ill, to support each other in times of crisis. That is often kind of reproductive labor that is not greatly valued in many, especially capitalist societies.
I have something to add to this. And it's connected to a high level of migration, especially from smaller cities, because mostly men migrate to earn money either in Poland or Lithuania or Russia, because and then only women remain in these cities, and it makes them it pushes them to be active, and because it's they are only who stay in these small towns and in these smaller cities, because in smaller cities there is no work employment, no workplaces for men. They cannot earn money, so they migrate somewhere, and it's so-called like челночная migration.
Челночная immigration. I don't know how to translate that.
Yeah, like
it's like back and forth migration, basically migration to earn money somewhere else and to send money back home.
it's in Russian it calls отходники. Men who for like summer season go somewhere else, earn money and bring them home and stay winter, or vice versa.
We have one more question. We're a little over time. It's actually two questions, but they are related. So one is, I really appreciated learning about the deeper history of protest in Belarus, which is rarely mentioned in international media. So true and very sad. I'd be curious to know if and how global protest movements from Arab Spring to BLM to Women's March have influenced the tactics used by 2020 Belarus protesters. And the second question is related to it, but all kind of with the opposite intention. Of course, protest in Belarus is one of the peaceful movement, writes the person who inquires. But what was unique there? Can you name some differences comparing it to other social movements around the world? So compare and contrast.
Yeah, okay. It will be a short anecdote. When once with my friend we started a discussion which handbook on peaceful protest can we read to organize something on Minsk Street, or in his case, or on Grodno Street in our case, because there is no handbook of peaceful protest. On the one hand, yes, there are a lot of studies of different peaceful tactics, but on the other hand, Belarusian protest turned to be so different from many other protests. So, and when I was Googling strategies of peaceful protests, I found out that you have to go to police and ask a permission to march. How come? When I was in Hamburg in 2006, I went to police and asked a permission to have a picket or small demonstration to support Belarusians who were at the time protesting. In Belarus, it stopped all these tactics. Not all, of course, but it was an anecdote. Nobody expected that it will reach such high level of artistism and creativity. I didn't expect it in July. I couldn't imagine such level of creativity that so many different placards. There were so many different placards, so many different performances, so many different shows when musicians came to protest. Yeah, but of course, it needs to be learned in order to compare with other protests.
I mean, I'm just taking a stab at this because that's, of course, a really big question. And I think I want to come back for one to one thing that Arina mentioned in her kind of initial presentation, was the role of digital technologies and in Belarus. That was definitely something when I started to visit Belarus with some regularity again. Now, there was a little bit of a break in between the early 2000s and 2015. I was flabbergasted by the number of different kind of social media channels people were using, and that was basically also the main channel of communication and information exchange, and in so many ways that I remember many times that I was like, I don't know what's going on. Where is a theater performance? What is happening? And they're like, well, it's all on Facebook. So you kind of really had to keep up with things. You had to be friends with the right people, and you had to be kind of involved in that circle. But once you're in, you're in. And so I think that level of networking through social media is really crucial, I think, for what has happened in the last few months. And but again, that's something that has emerged over time. That was not something that came out of nowhere on August the 9th, although I think it exploded. I mean, I'm now subscribed to so many Telegram channels, I can't even follow all of them, which before I had like a few. So I think that really plays an important role. And just coming back to the question, I think the Arab Spring was the first moment when that really was one of the major forms of organizing. And then Occupy in the United States also was primarily organized through social media channels. So in that sense, the protest in Belarus falls into kind of a trajectory of technological development that we can, I think, see very, very clearly. But there was another dimension to the question as a nonviolent movement. I think that is a very important moment, and I think it's also what is so impressive to most observers from the outside, especially people who don't know Belarus very well, is that people continue to remain nonviolent even in the face of an incredibly brutal reaction. I mean, it was a level of brutality in the 3 nights on August the 9th through the 11th that it left me speechless for quite a while, and I think has left many speechless still today. And it has an impact on Belarusian society that I think we can't even really estimate or understand at this point, both on the level of the victims, people who have been injured physically and psychologically, or grappling with the repercussions of beatings, of humiliation, and severe physical injury. But also imagining how to build a new society after, hopefully, Lukashenko, with thousands of people in law enforcement who have committed that violence. How do you integrate those who are the perpetrators, essentially, of an incredible level of violence? And I don't want to use the term perpetrator trauma, which has been becoming somewhat problematically prominent recently. But how do you integrate a large part of the population? And I know it's only a few thousand, but it's substantial still, who have participated and committed violence to an extent against their neighbors. There needs to be an open conversation. I think it's going to be a very, very difficult conversation. But that I really hope and trust that the current movement that is so committed to nonviolence will be able to find a productive way to do that. But it's going to be a challenge for sure. Well, you're muted.
I also got disconnected by literally kicking my computer off of the desk. Anyway, with that jolly note, thank you very much to Arina and to Annika for providing your valuable insights into the situation in Belarus. Thank you very much to Hope and the Museum of Culture Environment for hosting the event. Let's just all hope for the better future for Belarus and for the protests to continue their nonviolent, amazing, peaceful streak. And there was one last question that I kind of answered, which was, well, will there be more events like that? And I hope there will be. And if you're interested in Belarus, I really want to encourage everyone to keep Belarus in the public eye, especially in the eye of the international community. There is a Facebook group called the Belarusian Protests that you can join that posts routinely various webinars and Zoom events and colloquia that are going on the protest in Belarus, and just keep an eye on Belarus in the international news. And we hope to return to this discussion sometime later, triumphantly, after Lukashenko.
Well, it would seem that Volha's computer has now kicked her off well and good, unfortunately.
Too bad.
But
Yeah.
I'm not Olga, but I do want to, oh, you're back.
I had a whole spiel. Did you guys hear it? I was like, don't forget about Belarus. We need to get
froze for a bit. You froze for a bit. Yeah. Yeah.
I know. What a disaster. I'm sorry. I should blame my dog, but it was actually me who kicked the computer off the table. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Thank
and
you.
thank you all for attending and for really thoughtful questions. And Arina and Annika, I mean, just such a really insightful, nuanced breakdown of what's going on right now, which really leads us to a lot of careful thinking about what's going on in Belarus. But I would also say what's going on all over the world in terms of popular protest.
Exactly. Keep an eye on Belarus. Let's hope to return to this conversation after Lukashenko's gone. That's the final speech.
And then with Olga.
See you.
Exactly. And back with
real
Olga.
Olga. Yes.
Mhm, the real Olga. All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.